Hi, I'm Andrew Kralka, and today I'm going to run down my favorite CCM albums by decade, the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and the first 2 decades of the 2000s. Coming up next, right here on Andrew's Journey in Christian Contemporary Music. Welcome to Andrew's Journey in Christian Contemporary Music, where we dive into the classics, discover what's new, and demonstrate the originals. Hey, if you're into all things Christian contemporary music, I would encourage you to hit that red subscribe button. And don't forget, if you like this video, if you're liking what you see, to give the video a thumbs up. Come on aboard, let's do the CCM journey together. So today we're going to dive into some classics, and how we're going to do it is I'm going to run down my favorite albums by decade. Now these are the albums that I have owned. I haven't had a very big collection over the years, a few hundred. I know some people have like thousands. But these are albums that were in my collection that I consider my favorites. I'm going to give you my favorites with a little more detail, and then I'm going to give you a couple of honorable mentions for each of the decades. And hey, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love for you to send your comments below and let me know what your favorites are by decade. And just share that. I'd love to hear from you. So here we go. First, I better say that there were a couple of ground rules that I made for myself. One, that I was never going to mention an artist more than once. So you won't see two albums from any given artist in this list. And the other rule I made for myself was I wasn't going to choose any compilation or greatest hits albums. However, there are live albums. So let's get to it, starting with the 70s. My favorite album from the 70s was really a no-brainer for me. It comes from my all-time favorite Christian rock band, the Resurrection Band, and their first official album, 1978, Awaiting Your Reply. I say official album because earlier on, when they got started, they released a couple of independent demo tapes, but it wasn't until they got a $8,000 gift that they were able to go into the studio and record this album. And this album was a bit of a game changer because at the time in CCM music, 1978, there wasn't a whole lot of heavy rock music out there. So this one really rattled some chains when it came out. Think of bands like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and Jefferson Airplane. You've got Wendy and Glenn Kaiser, who share the vocals. Wendy's kind of got that Jefferson Airplane Grace Slick kind of sound to her. And then Glenn also plays electric guitars and other instruments. You've got Jim Denton on bass, John Heron on drums, and Stu Heiss on lead guitars. And it's a great album. My personal favorite on this album is the nearly 7-minute Broken Promises. Just a real great passionate vocal from Glenn as he really does well. And the song is really kind of like a plea because we're not holding up to our end of the bargain. So we're breaking promises to God. He doesn't break them on us. And it's a song that has always helped me to draw close to the Lord, especially early in my Christian walk. Another song on here that I think is a little bit underrated is the song Golden Road, an acoustic-driven song with actually an acoustic guitar solo in the outro that is coupled along with a great drum and percussion jam at the end. Just great, but this whole album, right from the rocker waves at the beginning to the song called The Return, the last track, which talks about the return of Christ, just a solid official debut album by Resurrection Band, Awaiting Your Reply. For my two honorable mentions, the first one was recorded late in 1976 and came out in early 1977. It is the second solo album from the incomparable Phil Keaggy, Love Broke Through. and he recorded the song that was co-written by Todd Fishkin, Randy Stonehill, and Keith Green, called Your Love Broke Through. Oddly enough, my other honorable mention is the first album of Keith Green, the 1977 album, For Those That Have Ears to Hear, which he also recorded the song Your Love Broke Through. Now, Keith's, to me, is the definitive version. Phil does a great job of the song, but Keith, even though Randy Stonehill and others did that song as well, I think Keith's is really the best version. Both these albums are awesome. So let's go on to the 1980s. My favorite album from the 1980s comes from an artist that started in a CCM kind of vocal band and then broke away and started to go solo and was even more successful than he was in the band. He had a pretty decent first album, a really well-respected second album, but it wasn't until his third album came out that he made, in my opinion, the masterpiece, and it was his self-titled album from 1987, Russ Taff. Just a great, great album. The production on this is amazing. The studio musicians were awesome, but really when it comes down to it, it's Russ's vocals that just make this album what it is. Just one passionate plea after the other, as the album is dark and it's moody, and it's a real crying out tour de force. I know a lot of fans would probably say that the song written by Michael Biehn, I Still Believe, is the best song on the album, and they may be right. But for me, the ballad-like song that was written by Chris Eaton called Believe in Love is the one that just kills me. Russ's gut-felt vocals on that second verse, actually on the whole song, you can just really feel the soul and his gut-wrenching vocals on it. Just great sound, great production. The drums are huge on this album, right from the opening rocker shake right to the very end, the beautiful closing healing touch. Just one amazing track after the other. Now, for my two honorable mentions from the 80s, the first one, we go back to 1983. I became a believer in 1984, and I was always looking for something that was up my alley at the time, and I was listening to a lot of hard rock and blues rock, prog rock, and some metal too. And one of the first albums I discovered was the 1983 third album from the group Barnabas, Approaching Light Speed. And this album was right up my alley. Great rockin', early 80s metal, prog elements to it. I would go on to like most of their other material, but for me, Approaching Light Speed was always their best album in my opinion. And the other album of my honorable mention for the 1980s, we go from 1983 all the way to the end of the decade, 1989, and this was the sixth studio album by the great arena rock band Whiteheart, and the album is Freedom, 1989. Again, like the other two albums I just mentioned from the 80s, great production on this. Actually, this, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was the only album that legendary producer Brown Bannister produced for the group. And just the first four songs were staples at Whiteheart concerts, great arena rock. You're talking Bye Bye Babylon, Sing Your Freedom, Let the Kingdom Come, and Over Me. And just some great stuff. Actually, my favorite on the album is a song at the near the end called Let It Go, that has this real great bass groove to it. I was a bass player. That's where it got started, so I love that kind of thing. So anyways, that's my other honorable mention. Whiteheart, Freedom. Let's go to the 1990s. For the 1990s, we go to a live album, maybe one of my favorite live albums ever. This was from a band that I saw a video of a single they released, but I could never seem to find their music in my local store. But coming back from a trip to the States, we stopped in at a bookstore in Pennsylvania, and I finally found something from them. And it would turn out to be the only thing that I owned from them, but it was amazing, amazing double live CD. I'm talking about Celtic rock, prog rock, UK band Iona, and their double live CD, Heaven's Bright Sun. This is one of those albums that you just want to put on headphones and just listen. It's not a rah-rah kind of album. You got the beautiful and at times haunting vocals of Joanne Hogg. You have co-founder Dave Bainbridge, who plays guitars and keyboards. And just with the rest of the band, it's beautiful. It's atmospheric in spots. It's haunting in other spots. It's rocking in other spots. There's a great song on here called Inside My Heart, which ends with like a 2.5 minute guitar solo from Dave Bainbridge. Just incredible. They've done multiple studio albums, no longer around. Dave Bainbridge has gone on to do other things, but I was so glad that I found this. Iona, Heaven's Bright Sun, great live set, 18 songs. For my honorable mentions for the 1990s, we go back to 1990 and the 11th album from what was then probably considered the most popular Christian rock band in the world, Petra, and their album Beyond Belief. Beyond Belief, the first 5 songs on that album, just great arena rock. You know, you had Armed and Dangerous, I Am on the Rock, Creed, the title track, and Love. But for me, my little gem on the second side of that album was a song called Last Days, a little bit more haunting vocal by John Schlitt and 2 guitar solos by Bob Hartman, including on his outro solo a little ode to Jimi Hendrix. If you put the song on, you may pick up the riff from Purple Haze. So that was Petra. Now my other honorable mention, a little different, we go to adult contemporary music, and the 1995 fourth release from Christine and Scott Dente, a couple otherwise known as Out of the Gray, and it's Gravity. Now this is, again, like the Iona album, is the only thing I've owned from them. I know people who are well versed in Out of the Gray would say their debut album, or their third album, Diamond Days, might be their best, but I never owned them. So this is a great album, great contemporary, adult contemporary music. You got some jazzy spots. Christine's vocals so silky smooth, and Scott's rhythm acoustic guitar playing, very underrated guitar player. So there's some great stuff there. So that's my other honorable mention for the 90s. Let's go on to the first decade of the 2000s. Okay, so I consider the first decade of the 2000s really a golden age of modern worship. Now, I know that modern worship probably started before that, and there's a lot of modern worship and classic worship that was recorded before the first decade of the 2000s, and there's been stuff that's come out since. But for me, from about 2001 to 2011, just some great stuff out there. So there's no surprise that my favorite album of the first decade of the 2000s and one of my honorable mentions are worship albums. So for my favorite, I go to 2004, and this artist who's had an incredible impact on my life as a worship leader and a songwriter. I could have gone with his studio album of a couple years that came after that, which was award-winning, but I decided to go with the live release of 2004 because it has some personal attachment to me, in that when we were going through a rough time during a neighborhood tragedy that happened, we put the DVD version of this album on and just soaked while we tried to come to grips with what was going on in our neighborhood. And I'm talking about fellow Canadian and singer, songwriter, worship leader Brian Dirksen, and the live album called Today. Ever since that moment and going forward, I mean, this has had an impact on me. I brought many of the songs from this album into my worship sets on Sunday mornings when I played in our local body. And yeah, it's beautifully orchestrated. I mean, you got everything in here from adult choirs to children's choirs. You got strings, you got a jazz ensemble, you got guest singers, you got this oboe player that plays some beautiful lead stuff. And you got Brian and his core band, just beautifully put together. 18 songs. Some of the songs were newer songs for Brian, some of his old classics, and a couple of hymns thrown in. Just terrific stuff. Check this one out if you're into worship music. Put it on and just soak it in. Wonderful stuff. Brian Dirksen Today. Now, for my honorable mentions, I stay in Canada, but jump out of the worship genre for a moment. I got into this band after hearing a number of their songs on our local radio station for a while. I first heard about them when they were nominated for New Group of the Year, New Artist of the Year at the Dove Awards, and heard their song. But they only play a couple minutes when they do those award shows, so it didn't really give me enough to go on. So I was okay with it, but it wasn't until I started hearing more of their songs on the radio that I'm like, I gotta check these guys out. I almost went with the first album I bought of theirs, but decided to go with the one that they put out a couple years later. I'm talking about the Canadian group Down Here, Ending is Beginning. There may be people that know this band from the very beginning and have followed them. Some of you may recognize the name Mark Martel. He was one of the lead singers on here as well, or from this band, as well as Jason Germain. Mark Martel, about 10 or 11 years ago now, did a video of the Queen song Somebody to Love that went viral. He ended up on the Ellen show. It was for this Queen extravaganza that they were auditioning people for, and it went viral because he sounds like Freddie Mercury. So you may recall that. But anyways, this is the band he was with. They're not together right now, I guess, on a indefinite hiatus, but check these guys out and check this album out. Ending is Beginning from Down Here. And for my other honorable mention, I go back to the worship genre and another worship leader that has had a huge impact on my life, and that would be Matt Redman. Now, this was not the album that went gold. That album came out a couple years after this, but to me, this is maybe one of the best albums of declaration. We Shall Not Be Shaken, Matt Redman from 2009. Just like with the Brian Dirksen, I brought many of the songs from this CD into our church body, into my Sunday worship sets. Just some great stuff, declaring to God and for God. Just some great stuff on here. One of my favorites of Matt's, maybe a little bit underrated even. So that is my other honorable mention. And now finally, the 2010s. So for the 2010s, my favorite is kind of out of the mainstream. You may not have heard of this guy, but if you're into progressive rock music, you may have heard of him, probably heard of him. I didn't hear about him until about 10 years ago or so, 10 or 11 years ago. He's started with a group in the 90s that was a part of the resurgence of prog rock in the 90s. Decided to go solo, had a number of great solo prog albums, but then in 2015 got another band together and they put out their first album, which was really good. But then 1 year later, they put out this monster of an album, double album, loosely based on the classic Christian literature from John Bunyan, Pilgrim's Progress, and I'm talking about the Neil Morse band Similitude of a Dream. This thing is like over an hour and 45 minutes in length. So it might be a tough listen for some, but if you're willing to put on some headphones and put aside that kind of time and just listen and appreciate the musicianship, the story, and just how well this is put together, you might actually like something out of it. It's not for everybody, I know, but it's just reinvigorated my love for progressive rock music. I listen to a whole lot of Neil's stuff, his solo stuff, and other projects that he's got. But this for me stands out as the best that he's been a part of. So, The Similitude of a Dream by the Neil Morris Band from 2016. And for my two honorable mentions in the 2010s, we go back into the mainstream of CCM, very much so. The first one from maybe one of the biggest bands from the last 20 years in CCM, and that would be Mercy Me and their 2017 release, Lifer. I thought I was going to be a little bummed out by this album at first because there's so much kind of programming and drum samples on here and stuff like that, not so much of the band playing like some of their earlier stuff, but there's some great songs on here. I mean, Even If, I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably their best single since I Can Only Imagine. But just some great stuff on here, great message on here, and it gets my honorable mention, or one of them. The other one from 2018, and maybe one of the biggest current bands out right now, for King and Country, Burn the Ships. Now, these guys have the distinction of being the last band that I've seen live just before the COVID lockdown in March of 2020. That was literally their last concert before they had to cancel the rest of their tour. And they played every song on this album live. Just some great stuff on here. If you listen to the CCM mainstream radio, I'm sure you've heard all the songs on here. Joy, God Only Knows, Amen, Burn the Ships, and it's just some great stuff. My favorite on here is the song Control. I loved how they did it live. It was awesome. So that's my other honorable mention, and that's it. I hope you enjoyed this. Again, I would love to hear what your favorites are by decade. And maybe you haven't gone back. Try out some of these albums that I've showed you today. If you're fairly new to CCM, maybe you only got stuff from the last couple decades, I encourage you to dig in. But definitely leave your comments. Let me know what your favorites are by decade or just what your favorites are in general. And that's it. We'll see you next week, and we'll have another episode of Andrew's Journey in Christian Contemporary Music, where we dive into the classics, discover what's new, and demonstrate the originals. For now, God bless, take care, we'll see ya. Bye-bye.